All right, let's rock. So we're going to go through the van der Kolk text first. Okay, so I'm going to minimize all of you again. So as always, if you have a question, comment, anything, please just speak up. So the main, as all of you were reading and gathering, the main theme of all of our readings was really treatment. And, what can we do as therapists to hold space? Like, what are some techniques? But then also just really highlighting the importance of talking about it. So as we know, one of the kind of quintessential symptoms, maybe after effects of trauma, is this desire to avoid, this desire to not talk about it, this hope that if I don't talk about it, then maybe it'll go away, or maybe it won't affect me. But we know about the intrusive thoughts, these intrusive memories that can come in waking form, in nightmares, in daymares. I don't know if you're taking a nap during the day, but if you're sleeping, if you're awake. So just the importance here with breaking the silence. So we also know that there can be a very strong shame element with trauma, particularly when some of the narratives around things like sexual assault are, what were you wearing? Were you drinking? Are you sure that you didn't send mixed messages? Even potentially some of the, narratives around that are pretty insensitive about going into combat of like, well, that was your choice. Or, some of the messaging within the military of like, suck it up, you should be stronger than this. So we know some of those more like contextual social messaging that can really reinforce this shame around, oh, so if I'm affected by this, then I must be weak. So I'm going to put on a face that indicates to others I am fine. And then I'm just going to hope that things stop affecting me as much. So really, this silence is twofold of this internal hope of, if I don't give this thing attention, maybe it will go away. And then, this external pressure from others to be okay, because as a society, we don't know how to hold space for people who have gone through really anything difficult. So that's what makes what we do really important. Also, so going to that second point, feeling listened to and understood changes our physiology. So again, going into that, a lot of things that we talked about last week around attachment and this importance of being validated and mirrored, and some of those residual effects, if that's not the case. Being able to articulate these complex feelings, having a vocabulary around that. What you'll probably find even outside of specific trauma work in this field is if emotions are a piece of what you do and you focus on in your work, you'll be educating a lot on just vocabulary, giving your clients a feeling wheel, or just giving them some psychoeducation around feelings. How do you differentiate between emotions that seem the same, but we have different emotional words for a reason? So having our feelings recognized. So these are things that we as therapists provide. So we provide a space where the client feels listened to, understood. We recognize their feelings, and this rewires their brain in a way on a neurological level to recreate some of those connections that have potentially been damaged or affected by the trauma. So if like a big mistake that we can make in this field, because being trauma informed, as some of you mentioned in some of your papers, it's not just taking one class. It really is a practice in being able to meet your client within these like really difficult narratives. And we'll talk about this, I think, in week 13 of, how does this affect us for kind of being these, receptacle for so much hurt and harm and trauma. So if we meet our clients, or if our client has had a history of being met with silence, or somebody who like really can't understand what they've been through, and maybe a way that they express that incomprehension is like maybe a denial of its effects, its gravity, that will negatively affect the individual, because we'll talk about this in a couple of sides of it, negatively affects one's ability to feel real. So as long as we keep secrets and suppress information, we are fundamentally at war with ourselves. So again, if we try to compartmentalize, if we try to deny pieces of ourselves, remember, one of the biggest pieces of what we do in trauma work is integration, is the understanding that there was a before trauma, there was a trauma, and there is an after trauma. Hopefully your client is in the after trauma space or situation in their life. That there has to be an acknowledgement of each piece of their story. So another thing that we find in this work, so it says here, hiding your core feelings takes an enormous amount of energy. So I'm gonna stop this here and look at y'all for a second. So how many of you are familiar with the concept? I can't even remember if we've talked about it in this class. I feel like I talk about it all the time because it's really important. Secondary and primary emotions. So, okay. So if anybody's familiar with that, tell me what a secondary emotion, what its function is, and what is a secondary emotion? So identifying the actual emotion.
Wouldn't a secondary, sorry. Who was that? Summer.
Go ahead, it's okay.
Oh, Summer, okay.
I just have like an example of it. So like a secondary emotion might be like anger. And then a primary emotion would be something that is more like where that anger is coming from, or the anger is more of an expression of what the more, I guess, the deeper rooted emotion is. So that could be, feelings of abandonment, loneliness, pain, different things like that.
Good. Thank you, Jada. Summer, anything to add to that?
No, she got it. It was anger. But I actually liked how, Jada, how you not only said sadness was like the underlying one, because I was going to say, underneath anger is oftentimes sadness, but I wasn't thinking about loneliness and abandonment. Like those can also be feelings and emotions in a way that explain like the sadness or, things like that. So thanks for that.
Absolutely. So yes. A secondary emotion is an emotion that so when I think of a core emotion, I literally think of like the core of the earth, or like in your heart, where if you were to have an experience and you're kind of drilling down into the core of your emotions, you hit anger first. So and as you said, Jada, it's more of a signal. It's like it's an alarm that something's not quite right. Maybe a right of yours has been infringed on. Like maybe, like you're not being able to, you're not given space to talk like in a meeting or something like that. Or you said no to somebody and they're still insisting on something. So like that initial, it's this spark of like, something's not quite right here. And many times what we're not reinforced to do is kind of go any further than that anger. So anger is an expression of a boundary being crossed, and it also serves as potentially this protective factor or this protective technique to get somebody away from you, right? So like when somebody's angry, what does it indicate for people to do? Like, get away from me. So it's very protective. It's a way to kind of like puff your chest, put up your shield, and protect yourself. So usually like how many times have you been talking to a client and you're like, how do you feel about that? Well, I'm pissed. And then it's like, well, and then they just like their overarching feeling for so many different scenarios is mad, upset, frustrated, pissed. And so what you find with clients like that is they get stuck, right? Because they're not actually identifying what that anger is protecting. Like you said, Jada, and they're really vulnerable feelings like abandonment, incompetence, ineptitude, like the loneliness, these very difficult emotions that, quite frankly, as a society, we really don't encourage. We would rather see people angry than truly vulnerable. So I say that because that's where some clients can get stuck if they've experienced some kind of trauma. And we'll talk about it probably next week because it's in the latter part of the slides, is some of these desires for things like revenge, compensation. And those are really driven by some anger, some potentially secondary emotions. So yeah, I just really wanted to highlight that because I think it's a very common sticking point for clients that sometimes as therapists, we kind of let them get away with. How do you feel about that? How are you affected by that? I'm pissed. Okay, that's great. And then you'll likely find your clients that will get stuck there. So I encourage all of you in the spirit of vulnerability to educate your clients a little bit more about secondary and primary emotions and get them speaking from that more honest, vulnerable place. That's a lot more difficult to do. But it's truer and it helps remove some of that shame that might be underlying the stuff that's going on. So thank you. Any other thoughts, questions, comments on that? All right, well, let's keep going. Yeah, so again, it's if you're not being honest with where you're at, it can just really eat away at a person. So our job really is to create this space of honesty and vulnerability and openness where we're attending to the client in like all of their truth, where they're able to share things that maybe really don't feel, they don't feel permission to do in other spaces. So just, really highlighting this of when you're able to share these experiences, these truths with another human being, us, and ultimately what we're hoping to provide for the client is their ability to find and create a support, like either tap into an existing support system, cultivate like a newer or new support system, and find people in their everyday life that they can talk to about this. This also can be in the form of like group therapy or, some sort of other support. So I wanted to highlight this last piece here. Communicating, like the ability to communicate fully is the opposite of being traumatized. So if you think about an individual who's experienced trauma, in the moment of, really this inability to share, this inability to, and not having space to focus on self, that's what we're turning that other oriented perspective into a self-oriented perspective. So again, a lot of the stuff that van der Kolk talks about, as we've covered in class prior, is like a lot of that neurobiology right now is what we're reading. There's other parts of this book. So really this whole slide is talking about the wholeness of the individual. So there's two distinct forms of self-awareness, one that keeps track of the self across time and the one that registers the self in the present moment. So these are two of the systems that we're tapping into as therapists is, having that chronology, right? We're doing some autobiographical work, understanding the person in history, and then a lot of the actual, intense work that we're doing with an individual who's experienced trauma is this exposure, is this activation. So being able to stay grounded while while talking about potentially re-experiencing the trauma, but still being able to talk about it and maintain a sense of presence, meaning that they're in the experience while they're, whether they're visualizing it, whether they're talking about it, whether they are writing about it, but then they're also here and now oriented, knowing that they're not in a space of danger. So it's this dual recognition of awareness. So I highlighted this last part here. I plucked it from the text, and what van der Kolk was talking about was working with an adult individual. And this adult mentioned feeling, she mentioned something about her past, and like when she was, I think she was 8 or younger, when she had experienced some trauma. So some of the work that we do in this space is attending to the individual when they were in the trauma, meaning, so I'm 36, for example, if I experienced trauma when I was 7, my therapist might ask me to go back to that time or speak to that 7-year-old version of myself from my 36-year-old's place, to really tap into some of that healing, and quite frankly, maybe even like correct some faulty thought process. So a lot of some of the things that we read about this week were about individuals who kind of thought that they had more agency during their trauma than they did. So maybe they have like this like faulty schema of, yeah, I was 5, I should have known better than to, spill my soup, or I should have known that, I needed to do the dishes or like get myself ready for school, or these things that preceded the abuse. And looking back and being more realistic about like, what do you actually have control over at 5? So this last piece, I asked her to allow that frightened, abandoned girl to tell her what it had been like to be alone, her illness compounded by family rejection. I think she was diagnosed with like bipolar or something like that. And then the family being like, ugh, not in our family. So just, being willing to go back into those places that were very poignant, and potentially rewrite some of the story that you have told yourself. So here, another experience of this is, so van der Kolk says, if a patient tells me that he was 8 when his father deserted the family, I'm likely to stop and ask him to check in with himself. What happens inside when he tells me about that boy who never saw his father again? So again, tapping into more of that, like almost like carnal experience of trauma, because, looking at it from an adult perspective is very different from like remembering, where was I at developmentally, intellectually, emotionally at 8, where it registers in his body. So the, section of this book is called, or that this portion is called, The Body is the Bridge. So tapping into, so that mindfulness, that holistic experience of the trauma, when you activate your gut feelings and listen to your heartbeat, when you follow the interoceptive pathways to your innermost recesses, things begin to change. So it's that mind-body connection and really being able and willing to tap into that. So this is how you would foster it, of like, when you get a sentence like this of, I was 8 when my dad deserted the family, then that's a cue to you of having that person go inward. And as we know, attenuating that and titrating that to make sure that they're within that therapeutic window of tolerance, right? So we don't want to push them and overshoot the window. We also don't want to undershoot the window and just kind of be there being nicey nice with them. I mean, meaning like, yeah, I'll just be a empathic listener and I won't challenge you. I won't push you in any way. That is also been shown to not be helpful. So making sure that you're taking these cues to help the person go inward and connect this emotional experience with these bodily reactions and being more aware of that. Because as we know, when an individual has particularly experienced complex trauma, they may not really be attuned at all with their body, or thinking of traumas that are a violation of the body. There is a genuine disassociation that happens. There's a genuine disconnection that happens from the body. So really helping them to build a bridge between those two.
Dr. Lappin,
Yeah.
I have a question. So
Sure.
it sounds like on that one, that's more so like a gap between you being an adult and you tapping in as like your childhood trauma or experiences. Is there like more specific for like a child that's trying to that you would want to do that with a child? Like, it seems like there will be differences just based on the fact that, you know, they're still maybe in that development stage. And
yeah, that's a great question, Summer. So for those of you who took the TFCBT training, how would you answer Summer's question? So this is a kind of an adult that theoretically, and sometimes we erroneously assume that they have capacities that adults have, meaning like mental, emotional capacities that, oh, you're in your 40s, you should probably function like you're in your 40s. And chronologically, they might be there, but developmentally, they very well may not be there. So don't make those assumptions of your clients. But what Summer's asking is, if you're working with a child that maybe has experienced a trauma recently, or they're not very far removed from that trauma, how might this look different?
I didn't do the CBT training, but I do think there might be a lot more psychoeducation involved. Like, you can't expect them to know how they're feeling and what their emotions are necessarily. So maybe it's, you know, taking out the emotion wheel and like explaining what these emotions are and asking more direct questions of, is this how you feel? No. Okay. Is this how you feel? Rather than just making the assumption that they have the language.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you're guiding a little bit more than kind of following the client in that.
What I've understood is when working with children, a lot of their communication is couched in the symbolic. So it's kind of reminds me of that example you gave with the child who was drawing the trampoline and working with that, with their symbolic material that they provide.
Yeah, and that's another, thank you for that, Daniel. That's another technique that can be used both with children and adults. So of the kind of almost that step away from talking directly about the experience, meaning that if a drawing is created, generally it's some sort of inner experience, right? So they're drawing themselves, but you don't have to make it about them. So you can say like, you know, who is this? Oh, that's Stacy. Okay, how might Stacy be feeling? What's going on with Stacy right now? So that gives the child the opportunity, and the adult, right? Like we do this with, like we do sand tray with adults, we do play therapy in a way with adults, we do narrative, opportunities for adults to talk about things that are one removed, meaning that they're not talking directly about them. So they're not coming from an I position, because sometimes that's really scary to say, I am feeling, this is my experience, to like own that verbally. The hope is that they get there. But to start, you might say, basically understanding that whatever I'm creating is representative of my client's experience, but I'm going to allow them to talk about that from like a second person. or from a more distanced position. So that might be a way that you could create that summer, is having them do that multimodally, which all of you did in your disaster review, which was beautiful. Y'all did a great job. And then speaking from a distanced eye position. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great question. And great suggestions, Daniel and Miles. Okay, so one of the things that we learned in our readings was sometimes it's quite difficult to verbalize an experience. And one of the beautiful things and one of the potentially very beneficial things about writing is you can do it uninterrupted. Many times, you know, as you've probably experienced in your own just like personal life, maybe in the seat of the client, maybe in the seat of the therapist, is that, you know, sitting across from somebody and talking can be quite overwhelming, can be quite intimidating. And sometimes you filter, right? Because, you know, so thinking of the frame of mind of an individual who's experienced trauma, like what did that person have to do to survive that trauma? Of course, like, you know, natural disasters and stuff are potentially a little different, but if I'm, you know, the survivor of interpersonal violence, what I had to do was be very others oriented. That's where these concepts of hypervigilance come from, of making sure that I'm doing what I need to do to minimize or hopefully prevent the abuse. So I've been conditioned to filter, essentially, to not be as open and honest about my experience. And that's an element that's not necessarily there when you're writing. So when an individual is able to write, their experience may be more honest, because they're not editing for the sake of somebody else. They're potentially not being interrupted. And what we know is sometimes when we start writing, it's almost a free association experience of like, you start writing and then, oh, wow, I didn't remember this thing. So, what it talks about in this slide is the practice called free writing. So you can use basically the paper as your own Rorschach. And for those of you who may be unfamiliar, Rorschach is like a kind of an old school thematic analysis test. So it's a blot of ink that isn't anything. And then you look at it and it is supposed to tell like kind of some of your inner thoughts, maybe like inner schema, like archetypes, these kind. It was very psychodynamic in nature, to get kind of an inside look into your unconscious or your subconscious of like whatever you see in this like undiscernible or indiscernible blot tells a little story about you. So it's almost, free writing is almost like this free flow stream of consciousness. And you can write about anything. So anyway, just giving you all options of what to do when you are working with a client. And as we've learned both from those of you who took the TFCBT training, as well as those of you who took the CPT training, that writing is in both of those, where you write down as much as you can about the trauma. And then the goal is ultimately to say that, because it's just a fundamentally different experience writing it than verbalizing it. So other options for expression, and again, it's just this connection between mind and body. And another reason why we did the multimodal expression in your disaster review paper, of recognizing that there's a lot of different ways to express yourself. Particularly if you have, more of a left-brained, is it left brain? Left brain's the more creative side, right? client that you are willing to meet them in that space and have them, create a painting, a sculpture, a drawing, or whatever, have them choreograph something, create some kind of dance or movement, maybe have them write a song, perform a song, pick a song that's already been written that the lyrics, connect to them. So just really being willing to allow for that client to express themselves in like whatever ways that allow them to eventually, the end goal is to speak directly about your trauma, but these may be inroads to that process. As we also know too, sometimes there's limits to what we're able to articulate. So it should be expected that your clients have a very, very difficult time articulating and expressing what they've experienced. This doesn't mean, and also as we read in one of the other readings, I say later readings, I don't know what order you read these in, is that a fully cohesive, like, story with no gaps may not ever happen. So just really being patient with the client of knowing that they may not ever have this fully cohesive, no gaps in time kind of story. So this, we talked about this a little bit with treatments last week on some of like the limitations of a straight cognitive behavioral therapy approach, where there's this kind of fallacy at times where if I can just make sense and figure out why what happened to me, that the hope is that there's some relief that happens there. But what we've really found is that it really doesn't, it's not enough. Just being able to say, oh, that makes sense as to why this happened, doesn't necessarily relieve the person of these like residual emotions and these like after effects of the trauma. So here it says this top-down approach to change in which the therapist challenges or reframes negative connotations, as in, let's compare your feelings that you are to blame for your rape with the actual facts of the matter, or let's compare your terror of driving with the statistics about road safety. I really challenge you to please not do that. Because essentially what is this doing? It's essentially a cognitive distortion of intellectualizing, right? So we're going to take this experience of something that was traumatic for you and let me insert a whole lot of intellect into this. My guess is if you ever have the desire to do something like this, it's likely because you're feeling anxious and you're feeling uncomfortable and you're saying these things to soothe yourself, and you're really not thinking and privileging how the client might benefit from it. So that's whenever we make decisions like this, whenever we self-disclose, whenever we psychoeducate, whenever we provide kind of reframes like this, I always want you to think first, who is this benefiting? And then checking with yourself, how am I feeling? Wow, I'm like really uncomfortable right now. And I really need to like cut the tension in this room. Like that's something that you have to bracket, keep moving, and then talk to your supervisor about it. So when you are presented with a client that's having these like kind of, negative cognitions, it's my fault, all of that kind of stuff, it's best to treat these thoughts as cognitive flashbacks. So don't argue with them any more than you would argue with someone who keeps having visual flashbacks of a terrible accident. So they're basically saying these like cognitive distortions, these things that aren't helpful. These are the residual effects of the traumatic incidents. There are thoughts that when thinking or shortly after the traumas occurred that are reactivated under stressful conditions. So just conceptualizing the client as being reactivated, being in a stressful condition, and just kind of allowing, so you're not arguing, you're not trying to rationalize, you're not trying to take away potentially some of the distress with like, let me tell you about the statistics of this. So this is where you would go more to the emotion. You wouldn't really try to, correct this with some psychoeducation. So the piece of becoming some body, so becoming connected with your body. And here the focus was on, or the emphasis was on the reaction to the event, right? So here the analogy is like a splinter that causes an infection. It's the body's response to the foreign object. We can liken this to a trauma. The response to trauma that becomes the problem more than the actual trauma itself. So this is highlighting the importance of connecting back with the emotional experience, with that integration, and being able to be validated, for us to hold space, mirror, to validate, to empathize, to acknowledge. That is what is helping that person reconnect with the truth of their experience and actually be seen by another person, that allows them to feel like they're valued, to feel like they're, worthy. So that's what we provide in the space. So then we're moving to, I think this was I always say it wrong, I think the Cordis text. So any questions, comments on van der Kolk, the body keeps the score, and any questions or things that were confusing within that chapter, or something that really stood out that maybe I didn't cover? Okay, so we're going to cover phases 2 and 3. Where are we at with time? Okay, about 10 minutes. So just something to look out for and be aware of, that this really happens. So the broader form of post-traumatic avoidance is this experiential avoidance, right? So this is one of the aspects of, oh my gosh, systematic desensitization of, you're not only doing things imaginally, so doing them in the session, kind of, talking about them, closing the eyes if you feel comfortable, and just like picturing, but you're also doing things in vivo, that can be done in the session or out in between sessions. But this experiential avoidance really is avoiding the experience emotionally, and then avoiding any triggers. So with systematic desensitization, you're basically going kind of, not necessarily like back to the place of the trauma or anything like that. That might be a part of the treatment. But you are being aware of, are you avoiding persons, places, things, routes, like these types of things that negatively affect your daily life? Maybe we need to figure out a way to tolerate being in the presence of this experience. So again, it's this overall avoiding of any sort of bodily, emotional, or mental activation while thinking about this trauma. So avoidance plus extreme arousal states is the formula for post-traumatic emotional dysregulation. So we talked about the therapeutic window last week. So who can tell me and reiterate what is the therapeutic window, and what does it mean to overshoot, or basically fall short or undershoot? So what is the therapeutic window? And how do we gauge it? So what is it, and how do we know that we're in it or out of it? The idea of the therapeutic window is very important. So I'm happy to take a little bit of time. We can work together. Start us off. Somebody take a guess. So there's kind of two elements. I'm not going to give you the full answer because I do want to have a conversation about this. It does have something to do with timing, but it is more so having to do with emotions. So therapeutic window, what is it?
Is it something to do with the timing between the moment of trauma and when they're receiving treatment?
I would say partially, yes.
And like when they're ready for change?
How
or
do you
when
know?
Yeah, I don't know how we know.
Well, good. I'm glad that we're clarifying this then if anybody else feels similar to Miles.
And you said it more so has to do with an emotion.
Mm-hmm.
So is it them are being able to articulate an emotion, the emotion?
I would say that would be an indicator that they are, yes, I would say that that's an aspect to assessing the therapeutic window.
I could be totally wrong. My understanding was kind of that it's like how to talk about a client's trauma without it either becoming like too activating or not doing enough. So you kind of have to balance like overloading the client with underloading. I don't know.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Jesse. So how might you assess that? So yes, the therapeutic window is about emotional tolerance. So is the client indicating to you what either verbally, likely, probably non-verbally, of complete discomfort, complete overwhelm? So that's how you know that you overshot, meaning you pushed a little too hard. Maybe you had them stay in an activated state a little too long. And then the undershooting is usually when we're probably a little nervous, right? So it's like I'm just going to be kind of this supportive force and let you go completely at your own pace. I'm not going to challenge because I'm worried about potentially re-traumatizing. And that is found to not be helpful either. So we come to therapy expecting some kind of, nudge from our therapist. That's our job, is to attenuate or titrate to stay within. And that just basically means what we know of as like kind of scaffolding, making sure that we are really keeping our pulse on their window of tolerance. And so, yes, that's what that's what the therapeutic window is. So, Jesse, this isn't just for you, but you just answered the question, is how might we assess where the client is in regard. So if this is a therapeutic window, this is an overshoot, this is an undershoot, how do we know where they're at?
I guess just by how activated they're getting, but I don't know how that's like, determined.
Yeah, so that's absolutely a part of it, is to look at their nonverbals, look at their cues. Also talk to them, ask them. So this is where, when you're working with your clients, this is where that informed consent, that initial session is so important, to let them know, here's what we're going to be doing. Here's what you can expect when you're working with me. Also, I will be checking in with you, and I will continue to like build trust and show you my consistency. Your experience in this treatment, in this therapy, is very important. So I will consistently be checking in with you, seeing where you're at. How are you feeling? Tell me on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being totally unactivated, 10 being completely overwhelmed. Where are you at? So giving them some kind of like bumpers, right? And this permission to share their experience in the room so that they can help like advocate for themselves basically, and know that you're going to acknowledge that, you're going to honor that. So just having that exchange. And it could also be if they're in a space of not being able to like maybe be verbal, that's probably an indicator that you overshot, but also giving them permission to tell you in other ways, like with fingers or with a pen and paper or something like that. Daniel.
I've had experiences of overshooting,
Mhm.
and I think that sometimes those nonverbals they can be overlooked to the uninitiated, right?
Absolutely.
You know, because you're so focused on processing and the verbal and processing
Yeah.
that. I had an experience once just in the role plays that we do as trainees, and we were doing some parts work. And I think that the student kind of associated some of their own trauma with their role that they were taking on. And then I didn't realize that their leg was shaking really, really hard.
Mm.
You know, they were shaking, the leg was shaking. And she was just kind of processing her own trauma. And she had to pause because the parts work was so intense. And then we reviewed sort of the tape of the tail and realized like if we're going to do this kind of work, we need to be able to be really, really, really present on all of the, not just the verbal, but the nonverbal, how the body is reacting to and processing everything.
Absolutely.
So it's an example of overshooting.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. And remembering too that the nonverbals won't always be there. Like these obvious nonverbals of overwhelm, where maybe they're like hunched over, arms are crossed, diverting eyesight, which diverting eye contact isn't always meaning that they're overwhelmed either. Like I tend to, when I'm thinking, I have my like kind of brain spot where I'll go to. But anyway, I digress. When somebody is overwhelmed, they may have kind of taught themselves or conditioned themselves to not show any sort of distress. Again, in an effort likely for other people or an effort to protect themselves. So that's where, even if you're not getting these maybe obvious messages of discomfort from their nonverbals, give them an opportunity to vocalize it, to check in. How are you doing? How is the pace? How is the intensity? Can we keep going? Would you like to pause? Would you like to slow down? So just always, having their foot be on the metaphorical gas and brake in this process.
I think that's really important now more than ever, because I think a lot of us are doing Zoom sessions.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm lucky enough that I'm seeing my clients in person, but even just this week, there was one client who was shaking their leg the whole time. There was one client that was like playing with the threads on her pants. And it's like, those are things that I wouldn't have picked up on if this was all that I saw.
Absolutely.
So it is really important, whether you're in person or not, to maintain that like aspect of how are you feeling right now? Like, do you mind if I ask you this question?
Absolutely.
And that's why I don't envy all of you who are doing Zoom sessions. Like, that's so difficult. I mean, granted, I'm wearing a mask and my client's wearing a mask, and that adds another, kind of filter of interpretation. But yeah, I can't imagine how difficult that must be to only see like this 4x3 window of a person.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that, Miles. So let's go ahead and take a break. I'll create this poll. Hopefully I can, and I'll send you guys a link. And I'll see all of you back here at 11:12. Okay. Okay. So like I said, one of the ways to undershoot the therapeutic window is to like really simply just have a supportive conversation. And really what that looks like is, if you were to have a friend to come to you and say, hey, I'm having a really hard time with this thing, or this thing happened to me, sit there and be empathic, and that's really hard, and like, we can talk about it, I'll sit here with you, whatever. So and I think that that's a common misconception in what we do, right? Is that we're just like these really, it's like a friend that I pay for, and that's not what we do. So simply having a supportive discussion of troubling memories or current emotional difficulties isn't enough. So Ford, who's the second author on our treatment of complex trauma, has offered a deconstruction of what emotional processing is. So it's kind of these 7 aspects of what we can do to foster and encourage emotional processing. So it's this awareness of the physical and nonverbal cues that are associated with the states, right? So that's where you could take this verbal assessment or have this conversation of like, what's going on with you right now? So remember, it's about helping the client become aware, what are some of my physiological cues? How do I know that I'm starting to get activated? Because you can't intervene or you can't prevent, without avoidance, if you're unsure of what the cues are. So resetting or shifting these physical states in order to alter the emotional state. So if you know that a physical state is one where your heart is racing a lot, your stomach gets tight, you feel kind of nauseous, maybe you start to feel pressure in your head, you start to get kind of a headache, your vision might get blurry. So you're becoming aware of these states, and that's where resetting or shifting really means mindfulness, really means like learning how to self-soothe, learning how to de-escalate. So then a consequence of that is an altered emotional state. So you're not, because remember, it's the emotional response to the response. So it's like, shit, I'm activated. And then you become you have an emotional response to the activation that essentially kind of exacerbates the process. So then you're going to help the client verbally describe their physical or nonverbal state using emotional description. So this could be where you bring in some of those multimodal opportunities for expression. You might have them. I had a narrative therapist who was one of my supervisors. Not a great experience with her, but she gave nuggets. Where she would have the person, or it was like pre-made for them, where it's like an outline of a person, where different colors could indicate different emotions, and then you would put it on the body where they're feeling it. So it could be, where fear is red. You could color like their stomach red. You could color their chest red. So then that's just a different way of expressing it. So it could be that you're complementing the verbal expression with that, or maybe you're not quite there yet, and the person's having a difficult time articulating that. That's where you can, again, attenuate, titrate, scaffold, whatever term you want to use with it, of just essentially meeting the client where they're at. They're all fancy ways of saying meet the client where they're at. You want to distinguish between threat-based body emotional states and learning and exploratory emotional or exploratory oriented ones. So if the reaction is, I am in danger, this is threatening, I'm going to basically go into the coping skills that have helped me and been consistent and predictable for me before, of avoidance, of dissociation, of, whatever it is that I've been doing. And then the exploratory oriented ones is more of an acceptance of the emotional state, right? So this really aligns, we've talked about it before with ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy. One of the tenets of that is this non-judgmental stance of your responses. And I say response, I use that word purposely, kind of versus or compared to reaction, because a reaction, it can be more kind of knee-jerk, more automatic, and a response insinuate some level of thoughtfulness, maybe some forethought, maybe some pause before what is happening. So that's the difference between a threat-based response and an exploratory oriented one. Of the threat-based is, this is happening, this has to go away. And then the exploratory is, oh, I'm feeling this. I wonder what's going on. This is an opportunity for me to like learn more about myself or process a little bit more. So that's really the difference between those two states. Holding reactive and self-enhancing emotion states in awareness simultaneously and not privileging one over the other. So again, that's why I said responsive versus reactive. So this reactive, it's there. And it's the reaction to the reactive. So it's the, I'm so frustrated with myself that I still get activated over this. So the activation becomes secondary to the response to the activation. So please let me know if you want like further explanation of that. And then the self-enhancing emotional state is that exploratory, is that what's going on? Let me investigate this. I'm not going to judge it. This is like my truth right now. And I'm not going to react to it. I'm going to kind of lean into this. But one isn't to be denied and be judged, and one isn't to be privileged. So the recognition that you can have these simultaneous emotional states and be accepting of that. So then it's linking the emotional state to a personally meaningful narrative or a memorable life event and using this link to reinterpret their meaning and retrieve what was learned in those past experiences. So this isn't that, kind of like toxic positivity, right? That's another thing that people unfortunately provide a lot to people who are in distress of like, well, at least, or everything happens for a reason, like those types of really dismissive responses to distress and trauma. So it's not a, this thing happened for a reason, what can you learn from it? It's really about making meaning of one's lived experiences. And trauma isn't an exception to that. So what we have found is that making meaning of seemingly like chaotic, very difficult events can be very protective and can be very helpful. So it is connecting these states to meaningful narratives. So as you can see, like we're in a 6th step of what's going on here. And then 7 is to actively seek to reorganize, label, and consciously articulate the resultant personal meaning of different emotion states and their combination. So again, it's this acceptance of all of these emotions that are happening and allowing for this, the reorganization happens when you're able to attend to what happened, but also stay present in your current state. So if you're an adult who experienced something in childhood, it's a reorganizing around, what was I really able to do? What did I have agency over? And then being able to stay present while you're talking about it. So you're not dissociating, you're not avoiding. And so you can see how this is much more than just sitting and being this like warm presence in the room. Then, so you learned about a lot of different strategies and techniques. So this is really just an introduction. If any of these make sense to you, I really encourage you to do a little bit more reading on them, because it's out of the scope of this class to cover all of this in detail. The purpose of this is really to introduce you to these and know that there's so many options for you to kind of play around with and figure out what makes sense to me, what helps my client. So I encourage you to find familiarity with more than one of these approaches, just because if it makes sense to you, that's beautiful, but something that makes sense to you might not resonate at all with your client. So you always want to have options in what you do. And it may be that you find that integrating a couple of these approaches really makes sense. So this is more of a like a general strategy in terms of being trauma informed. So as you can see, SAFER, it's an acronym for self-care, acknowledgement, functioning, expression, and relationship. So these are just places to focus when you are in the different phases. So this comes from the Cordis text where the 3 phases are outlined. The stability, safety and stability in phase 1, emotional processing in stage 2, and then that integration in stage 3 and focusing on relationship support system. So self-care, symptom control, and stabilization, we know that that is phase 1. So it may be that what you need to do is equip your client with options of self-care, with tactics of self-care. And then as we know, we're assessing for environmental safety. We're like outside of the room and inside the room. We're also assessing for emotional safety inside the therapeutic relationship. And then within that, so kind of moving from phase 1 into phase 2 is this acknowledgement of the trauma and learning to acknowledge as opposed to avoid, but also normalizing and recognizing avoidance is protective. It's served you well. The reason you are in therapy is likely because it no longer serves you. And then you're going to assess for functioning. So again, this is the ability to live a life free from, or at least being less hindered by the effects of trauma. Daily functioning may also be more difficult in phase 2. I really wanted to highlight this because clients are relinquishing a familiar and comforting way of coping. So you're encouraging them to acknowledge as opposed to avoid. This individual may have been avoiding for years. So it's no different than, an individual who, for example, has been maybe using a substance for many years, and there's potentially this phase of chaos, of like real disequilibrium, of like, I don't know any other way to cope, and you're asking me to no longer do this. So it's learning a new approach that they can fumble, so just really acknowledging that this is a learning process, that this is a reorientation to healing. So just be aware that you are going to likely, even though somebody is like voluntarily entering treatment with you, entering therapy with you, saying like, I want to do things different, I want to get better, I want to heal, that you're likely going to get pushback when you say, okay, so those things that like served you pretty well for a long time, let's not do that anymore. So then, very characteristic of phase 2 of this expression of emotions and experiential awareness. So just same as kind of what you incorporated into your disaster paper of this multimodal awareness. So what we're trying to elicit is the sensory perceptual, physiological, cognitive, relational, and affective. So we're essentially wanting to engage all 5 senses and really beyond that. And then phase 3 really focuses on cultivating relationships and creating a support system or tapping into an existing support system. So then what the chapter covered was the beginning of the talking about the approaches were the ones that we do have some research. So prolonged exposure is one of the more studied and has been validated as being helpful. Also, just because something has been like maybe empirically shown to be helpful does not mean that it works for all clients. So one of the things that the authors offer is, instead of prolonged exposure, which is this repeated imagining or describing the traumatic event as if it were happening right now, while we as a therapist help them remain fully aware that it's not actually occurring. So they're staying in the moment of their trauma for prolonged periods of time. So this is really about hopefully what you're doing is you're expanding that therapeutic window, you're expanding the tolerance, their emotional tolerance for re-experiencing, verbalizing. So I talked about this a little bit earlier of this imaginal exposure and this in vivo. So one is the imagined and described as if you are actually in the moment of the trauma, of the experience. And then in vivo can happen in session, where, you know, maybe you leave the office to go somewhere, or maybe you ask the client to bring something to the office that is triggering. But really, ultimately, what you're doing is you're exposing yourself to these reminders that can be very triggering to the client. Again, it says here, situations, people, places, activities. So it might even be where you are creating a list with the client, and they're talking about people, they're talking about places, where again, in vivo is like actually exposing yourself to like the tangible thing. But the imaginal exposure is where you can like talk about the place or the people directly. So you might say, you know, like, my uncle is the individual who abused me. And then you might like imagine that your uncle is in the room. You could do like empty chair stuff, these experiential things. That would be what the like imaginal exposure could be. But what the authors offer is that maybe this prolonged exposure is just too much. And if it doesn't work, here's a modification for it. So they offer the option of graduate exposure, where, so instead of beginning, so prolonged exposure is where you kind of like go right for the hot spot. So when we talk about hot spots, what we mean is like the maybe portion of the situation or a trigger or reminder that is the most distressing, that creates the biggest response or activation in the client, where basically with prolonged exposure, it's like, let's go there. And then the longer that we're able to tolerate it, it's ultimately something like systematic desensitization. You won't be as triggered by this. And that's the hope, is the recognition that this thing happened to you. These things exist in your history, in your truth. Now our goal is to really just make it so it's not, so it doesn't affect you as much. So the authors say maybe this doesn't work for everybody. So potentially how you could modify prolonged exposure is, instead of beginning with the most troubling memories, you begin with the most mildly distressing, and then essentially like work up too. So you're kind of skill building along the way. Like instead of just diving into the deep end of the pool, you're in the shallow end, like dipping your toe in, seeing what the temperature of the water is. So again, you may say, oh my gosh, graduate exposure makes so much more sense to me. Prolonged exposure seems risky. Like I don't ever want to do that. It's still important for you to know that it exists, because potentially prolonged exposure is exactly what would be helpful for your client. So remembering that just because it doesn't resonate with you doesn't mean that it's not important to know, to be able to have that as a tool in your toolbox. So many of you took the CPT training online, so you have some like more expansive information than this. But this, for those of you who took the TFCBT, CPT is the client recalling and describing one or more specific trauma memories in writing. So they're cued to write as much about it in as much detail as they can. And so this is different from prolonged exposure and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, because those are more verbal. But the writing piece of CPT does eventually come into a verbal piece. So there is a sharing of the narrative. So the client writes the narrative in as much detail as possible. And then the hope is that this narrative becomes owned by the client. So again, it's the idea of integration. It's all about integration, is that this is like my real life. This is what happened. And it's not just this time, this incident, this occurrence, this period of time that was too terrifying to recall. But it's this, the hope is that having it on paper, having it in black and white makes it a little bit more real and present, and like you have agency over it. It's like more manageable. And then again, like I said, the goal after that, or the next step in this process, is to read it out loud. So then there's emotion-focused trauma therapy. So as we know, EFT, emotion-focused therapy, comes from experiential approaches from like Whitaker and Satir. It's informed, like Sue Johnson was a later wave of experiential. But as the title indicates, it's very emotion-focused. And then so you're wanting to bring up and examine the emotions that are elicited from the trauma, and then you are constructing a new emotionally coherent understanding of the incident. So as we know, many trauma narratives are very fragmented, many just spots of unknowing. And again, it doesn't mean that the end result of therapy is going to be this cohesive narrative without any gaps. But within emotion-focused trauma therapy, or EFTT, it's the use of these imaginal confrontation. So again, empty chair is a later wave of experiential. This also uses it. Clients imagine potentially the perpetrators of their maltreatment in an empty chair, where they directly express their thoughts and feelings to this individual. I suppose this could also work with like because sometimes as I shared in class, I think of, my own experience of losing my mom to cancer, and that was traumatic. Like the whole experience, she battled it for almost 5 years, and then I literally watched her die. So I was thinking of like, as I'm reading, how does this apply to potentially some of the stuff that I'm continuing to work through in my grief? And I'm curious if anybody has any thoughts on this, but I was also thinking of like, could you put like cancer in that chair? And I would argue you could. Like it's this thing. It doesn't have to necessarily be a person, because the trauma can be a non-human that has also happened. So I'm guessing, I'm not as familiar with this approach, so I don't know if there's like modifications or things that have happened. But really a lot of what we do is like these moment-to-moment choices, right? So if the client mentions this, you can throw it out there. Hey, would you want to talk? Do you think it would be helpful for you to say what you want to say to the cancer? For example. But empty chairs are generally where you put a person in, imagine a person being in that chair. But does anyone have any thoughts on that, of like the potential application to the empty chair technique with a non-human in it?
It's kind of an exaggerated stretch, but it almost sounds like in narrative therapy, the way that we externalize the problem and the way that we give it a name. And it just sounds like a bit of an extension of that, like whether it's cancer or whether it's anger or sadness, like whatever it is in that chair can be a way to communicate with this externalized problem.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you for that, Miles. And again, if you think of the overlap of approaches, narrative pulls from experiential as well, right? It was basically kind of like born out of the feminist movement that influenced therapy, that influenced the mental health field. So that beautiful connection. Thank you so much for that. So yeah, again, you're coming up with creative things. Like if you get an indication from your client that this is something that might be helpful, because externalization is generally a verbal experience. If you want to add an experiential element to it where you think that will be powerful and helpful for the client, do it. So just know that you have artistic licensure, you have freedom in these things to make them not only your own, but to co-create them with your clients. So these experiential exercises help to support changes that happen in perspective. So, it's this full body, movement, kinesthetic, experiential, right? So it's like you're engaging all of the senses really, so it can help a change in perspective. And then the hope is that it enhances self-improvement, self-esteem, reduces shame and self-blame, because you're verbalizing this thing and potentially having like a physical type of catharsis as well. So then there's imagery rehearsal and rescripting therapy. So the core emphasis of both of these is for the client to reconstruct the narrative of the traumatic nightmare, or again, waking intrusive memory. So as we know, these flashbacks and intrusive memories can happen really at any time. So the one of the aspects behind this is that our memory isn't necessarily just rooted in facts, right? So there's so many, this really talks, like, to me, this really pulls from this social constructivism, right? If all 17 of us were to have the exact same experience in 1 year, all of us would probably relay the story in a different way. And that's informed by aspects of our identity, where we were emotionally at the time, where we were emotionally at the time of the retelling. So all memory has been scientifically shown to be constantly evolving constructions that are more like malleable scripts than fixed and unchangeable facts. This, to me, it was a little bit unsettling too, but makes sense. Because I even think of, like, you know, when I talk about my mom, that the story is not always consistent. And like, I believe what I'm saying. So with the imagery rehearsal and the rescripting therapy, it's the recognition, and it's based on this notion that our memories aren't necessarily factual, that they are constructed. That's not to say that they're false, it's to say that we can interpret things, that there are these factors at play that inform how we remember. So another piece of this is these non-fear emotions, things that we talked about, the guilt, shame, and anger. So this is for prolonged exposure. So imagery rehearsal and rescripting therapy was added I think it was in an RCT, in a randomized controlled trial, was added to prolonged exposure. It was like a complement to it, where prolonged exposure had some, I think, pretty high attrition or pretty high dropout rates. But when imagery rehearsal, rescripting therapy was added to it, that it lessened dropout. It increased retention in that. So non-fear emotions were found to be predominant for all individuals who dropped out of prolonged exposure. So prolonged exposure really focuses on fear, right? So it's desensitizing to the fear, but there's other emotions that are connected to our traumatic experiences and our traumatic reliving and the residual effects. So suggesting that this simple habituation model may not be sufficient to address non-fear emotions in PTSD. So again, you might find that you, for example, incorporate or utilize prolonged exposure, and then you find kind of this other level of emotions, of awareness that have been brought to awareness, then you have other tools in your tool belt to attend to those other emotions. Narrative exposure therapy, so it's very brief, anywhere between 1 to 5 sessions. So it's, again, imaginal exposure and assisting the client in reconstructing a meaningful narrative of the trauma event. So informed by the fact that, again, our memories are constructed. And you can see this theme of really tapping into emotions and just verbalizing how you were feeling in the moment, how you're feeling in this moment, as you recall, as you share. So it's this dual acknowledgement of your emotional experience. So then you also have the option for psychoeducation through Target, Trauma Affect Regulation, a guide for education and therapy. So this is informed by the acronym FREEDOM. And you can read this, focusing the mind on one thought at a time, recognizing current triggers for emotional reactions. So I'm even thinking, like, if you wanted to do a group on, so for those of you who are at sites that maybe you have some freedom to do, no pun intended, to facilitate groups, that each of these could be a session where you're teaching about distinguishing dysregulated reactive versus adaptive main emotions. So you have this education around the emotions that can be triggered from trauma. You can have a session on evaluating or having your thoughts, defining your goals for treatment, and then having behavioral options. So, you know, how do you self-soothe when you are triggered? Like you have more options. We tend to have more options of like choices essentially than we think we do. So then the last is self-statements affirming that taking responsibility for managing intense emotions is crucial, not only for well-being, but also to making a positive contribution to primary relationships. So you can see too how this is congruent with the 3 stages model as well. So seeking safety, we learned a little bit about this, or it was alluded to in last week's reading, but this is kind of like a special consideration when the individual is also struggling with a substance use disorder. So as we read last week, many of the treatments for trauma, if an individual is also, you know, kind of having this PTSD comorbid with substance use disorder, many people will say, well, you have to get sober before we can do any of the trauma work. And that's not a like unanimously accepted approach. So seeking safety is an approach that focuses specifically on individuals who are struggling with PTSD and SUD. So it can be individual or group therapy. So again, there's a manual to this, there's a format and protocol for this. So if this makes sense to you, please seek out additional resources with this. So this is more long-term. So if you think just like substance use disorder treatment, because it may take a while for that person to be able to maintain a level of sobriety while attending to their trauma. It is not uncommon for a person to have a period of sobriety, lean into trauma treatment, you know, have some exposure into these triggers and these very traumatic recalling of their experiences and say, whoa, this is too much. And then they may have a lapse. So that's one of the reasons why this is longer sessions and over a longer period of time is those lapses. And I say lapse on purpose. In my postdoc, when I was working with cocaine use disorder, we differentiated between lapse and relapse, of like a relapse being this complete return to previous behavioral patterns, and a lapse being maybe just 1 or 2 times. So there is some difference between returning to what I had been doing completely and a kind of more of a slip. That distinction isn't really important to everybody, but that was something that we did as we were working with our individuals who were struggling with cocaine use disorder. So that's one of the reasons why in many treatments for substance use, that lapse is expected and quite frankly welcomed in the opportunity to learn something from that or to propel that person into a very strong commitment into sobriety. So seeking safety is specifically made for that comorbid or co-occurring disorder. So then there's STAIR, skill training and affect and interpersonal regulation. So this is also an individual therapy that lasts more long-term. 16 to 20 is considered a little bit more long-term. And this is specifically for women with complex trauma histories and who are experiencing chronic PTSD. So likely it is talking about many different types of trauma histories, but likely there is a focus on sexual trauma histories, particularly because the focus is on women. All right, where are we at? Okay, coming up on our time almost. So some considerations in conducting phase 2. So remember, phase 2, this is the work. This is where you are deep in the emotional processing. It can be very triggering. This is where you're really attending to that therapeutic window, where you're really making sure that people are in it because they're motivated. So as you're entering into, and potentially, I would argue even before this, but something to really consider is, as you're stabilizing, creating safety, that's helpful for anybody. If somebody comes to you in crisis, all these different applications for that. But I really want to highlight here the broaching the topic of, kind of tell me what brought you here, and helping to create space for this client to be very overt and honest about if they have like these pressures externally, because if they're not in it for, like, if they're not internally motivated to be there, this is a very heavy treatment. This is very heavy, emotionally heavy therapy. So if they're there because, they're pressured by their family or their job or something like this, I would really encourage you just to have a more lengthy conversation with them about that, and share your concerns about that, to talk about the reality of the heaviness, the difficulty, the distress, the discomfort that can be activated through this process. So also, you're likely going to get clients who believe that if I can just have a space where I say everything, if I just get this out, then I'll be better. And what research and clinical experience has shown is this, like, purging or dumping can actually have negative effects, because the relief that the client gets from it is generally pretty short-lived. And then there's this kind of recoil of, like, holy shit, what did I just do? Or, they're flooded with memories without you there to kind of help them work through it. And then they don't really have the skills to attend to that. So this is where, if you have a client that's like, okay, I'm just going to get it all out there for you to say, to really highlight and encourage the process, and taking this piece by piece and being very acknowledging and honoring of the gravity of what has happened and the importance of taking your time through this process. So you do want to be pretty directive and active with the client to say, I'm going to pause you here, and here's why. So as we know, the general theme with the approach is to be transparent, right? So we're transparent about the process. We're transparent about the education around, what to expect, what could happen. And you're also asking for consent all the time along the way. So it's best to encourage our clients, so to prevent or to, like, kind of push back on this desire to purge or dump, to do the processing work by carefully explaining the goal of reviewing the trouble memories in writing or through imaging, and then to develop this understanding. So as we know, those of you who are in clinical practice right now, you definitely get those clients that, like, talk the whole time. And I remember as a beginning therapist that I was like, okay, good. I just need to survive these 45 minutes. Like, when I have talkative clients, I'm like, great, then I don't have to intervene, and then I don't have to potentially, like, mess up. Now, as a more seasoned therapist, I'll be honest, like, it's frustrating when I have a client that and I, like, if that's a pattern. So I know every once in a while clients just kind of need to get it out there. But when the pattern is divulge, talk, what we know is that they're not really feeling what they're saying, right? They're not having this, like, connection between the words, and they're not necessarily aware of everything that they're doing. So our purpose is to slow down. So we want to give them the opportunity to understand and, like, make connections and actually feel, because that's one of the things that we know with trauma is they've dissociated from the feeling. So if they're sharing the narrative and they are completely emotionally detached from that, that's not really helpful. We want to help them have the emotional experience, but also be in a safe place to be able to have them have it in a safe way where they're not, frozen, or they don't go into some of those, like, fight or flight type responses. Also being very overt that processing this doesn't erase the memories. Like, you'll have many clients who come in and say, I just never want to think about this thing again. It's like, that's not really realistic. So you want to provide with them realistic expectations for therapy. And then it also may not ever become emotionally neutral. Like you may be activated, but the hope is that it doesn't interfere with your functioning. It doesn't interfere with like your daily ability to live. So also just being realistic, it's not going to erase the memories, and the memories may never be just a regular memory. Like you may be activated by that and have difficult emotions, but the hope is that you have skills to be able to not be long-term really negatively affected by this. Okay, we'll finish this slide. So what it can do though, is what processing can do is help the client have the ability to realize that I have options here. I don't have to be stuck in this really difficult, really distressing, really dysregulating emotional experience. So it's about feeling the impact of this, but it's manageable. It feels much more manageable. And then you're able to engage both your emotional and your intellect here. So you're having this ability to think clearly while you're in it. So you're not so emotionally activated so the hope is that you're no longer reactive to these memories. And then you're not trapped in the vicious cycle of, the reacting to the emotional experience and then, having this being stuck and then avoiding and then dissociating and then trying to process, but not being successful at it, or having this reliving this intrusive experience. So just the cycle of PTSD. So it's always another consideration particularly in phase 2 is that the client always is given the choice to stop, pause, regroup if they don't feel safe. So again, their feet are on the metaphorical gas and brake in this process. Because ultimately what we want to do is prevent decompensation. So we're saying to them at any point, if this becomes overwhelming, so we're still saying, can you do 10 more seconds? Can you stay in this emotion for just a little bit longer? But if you are getting cues from them that they're outside of their therapeutic window, that we're overshooting the window, then that's when you say, okay, let's pause. And also talking about the normality of that. I think that's no, not yet. But just the recognition that you're going to go from like phase 2 into phase 1 or stage 2 into stage 1. And that it's very normal for this stage approach to be reiterative, meaning that you can go back and forth in between, and that you haven't like failed because you are needing to kind of go back and maybe learn something or reattend to something. So we really want to normalize that for the clients, particularly those who present to us with a lot of shame. Okay, so before we take our second and final break of the class, it looks like there are 5 of you who are interested in just doing the paper, and then 10 of you who are interested in just doing the presentation. So let's do that. So your identity will eventually be known because I'll get papers from 5 of you. And then, so what we'll do is week 14, because we might just have to we might only have a part of the class to do this. So again, I'm just trying to figure out timing. But for those of you who endorse doing just the presentation, I'll think on that a little bit more. But remember, I want you to have the elements of the paper in the presentation. And I'm thinking that so if there's 10 of you doing it, you'll probably get like 15 minutes with your presentation. Okay. So for those of you who endorse the presentation, go for it. Those of you who endorse the paper, great. You are not expected to do a presentation. And I am zero surprised that no one wanted to do both. But I figure if you want it, we can do that. All right, so cool, we'll do that. And I will see all of you back here at 12:11. Hey, everyone. Let's hang out here for about a half an hour, and then I forgot to mention this during the last break, but if you have your pens and markers and colored pencils and stuff like that, if you don't, it's okay. Go ahead and grab them because I forgot to mention it to you. But then we'll take the last 15 minutes-ish of class to do some more drawing. All right, so let's get through as much of this as we can. All right, so are we recording now? Yep. Okay. So tactics, so we had tactics for, or technical considerations. Now we're going into tactics for optimizing effective intensity, physical arousal. Next one will be engagement. But these are just techniques that you can use, again, that can be integrated into really any approach, even if the approach has a protocol. So remember, protocols and stuff are great. They're generally made for research purposes, for like replicability, for fidelity, things like that. In clinical practice, we have a lot more artistic freedom. But I understand, like, some of you may be at placements where, you know, you have a very specific way of conducting therapy and stuff like that. You know, when you're able to have some more freedom with that, I really encourage you to play around with it. So the concept of flooding, or the technique of flooding. So this involves having the client re-experience the full memory with as complete and intense an awareness of physical sensations and emotional reactions as possible. So this can be incredibly overwhelming. It is really meant to engage all the senses, basically like to the brink of, you know, you're at the edge potentially of their therapeutic window. But it's this is the diving into the deep end of the pool. Systematic desensitization is more of the like stepping into the shallow end of the pool and then walking out toward the deep end. So this is a gradual increase in arousal and emotional intensity. So it's a graduated hierarchy. So systematic desensitization is utilized pretty commonly with phobias. So if I have a phobia, for example, of, let's say I have a phobia of small spaces, you're going to figure out, and you would create this list, this hierarchy with your client, where you say, okay, what would be the absolute most distressing, most triggering experience for you? They would be like, you know, being buried alive or something like that. Or being stuck in an elevator shaft or something like that. Then what would be something that is an indicator of that, but potentially pretty manageable. And so on this hierarchy, you might find that if you have 10 things, like, you know, being stuck in an elevator is it. That is the thing that would cause the most distress. And then maybe like closing your eyes or having your eyes open and imagining being in a closet or like a larger bathroom or something like that would be the least distressing. You might find that your client on the list of 10 things is maybe ready to start at 4. You're just creating a hierarchy. It doesn't mean you have to start at the lowest. Because that might be something that they've worked on prior, or just something that's like not as relevant to them or helpful to them to experience. So that's what you would do. And then the goal would be to work from 4 up until what many of you, when you went through the TFCBT, the example was a child who was physically abused by a stepdad in like the basement bathroom. And so the therapist went through with him, like, so the ultimate goal is being able to use that bathroom on his own. But the steps to get there was like being just in the basement, being in the basement and looking at the bathroom, being in the basement and going in the bathroom with his mom, being in the basement and going in the bathroom himself, being in the basement, going in the bathroom and like closing the door. So these are all very staged. And then the narrative reconstruction is used both in flooding and systematic desensitization, but it's the development of a first person story-like description of how the events began, unfolded, and ended. So again, very integrated and using ultimately the first person I. So narrative reconstruction can also be modulated where like we talked about before, where you're talking about another person, where you use art, where you maybe even use a doll, or you use sand tray, or something that takes the first person out, but the goal is to eventually get to that first person narrative. So then enhancing engagement, they talked about 3 different tactics here: somatic, affective, and motivational. So somatic tactics help the client become aware on their physical reactions and the meanings of those physical reactions and sensations. So again, mind-body connection. Affective tactics are to help that client expand their emotional vocabulary. This very well can come from something like a feelings wheel. If anybody's unfamiliar with that, please let me know. But really a feelings wheel, so I've seen many of them. So I can't see anybody. So if anybody endorsed not being familiar, I'm not sure, but if all of you know, I also don't know. But ultimately a feelings wheel is like where you have like the main, it almost looks like a spokes of a bicycle tire or something like that. Where in the middle is like kind of our 5 like major, like mad, sad, glad, angry, or whatever, emotions. And then as you go out in the wheel, they're sliced into smaller and smaller emotions that all fit within that category, so that you can kind of pinpoint and speak more specifically to your emotional experience. There's also lists online, like it doesn't have to be a feelings wheel. That just is usually what I use because it's like colorful and I feel like it does a good job of breaking down how you can slice emotions into more specific ones. So then the hope is as you're expanding their vocabulary, they have like confidence in their ability to express themselves and identify the emotions. So remember, if you've been dissociating for a long time, you might have you don't have any connection to like what it feels like in my body, or even what that feeling or the connection even to the feeling. So as we know, we identify feelings because we have some experience with them, and dissociation like disconnects the person from that. So there's more confidence in it, more connection. So there's more of a willingness to share. Again, one of the things that you're going to be doing with your client is figuring out who are people who are safe to share with, because not everybody is, I always tell my clients, like not everybody is worthy of knowing your feelings. So to really help them have some agency and discern for themselves, like who would be safe for that. And then, kind of liberating themselves of holding this emotional experience inside and letting it out. Then some motivational tactics are in identifying and building on the client's goals. So having that be a very collaborative process. And then processing their experience and how much effort they've put in and acknowledging the discomfort. So just identifying like, hey, here are your goals, and then here are some realistic experiences that you might have. Like it's not going to be super easy the entire time. There will be discomfort. It's going to take a lot of work, and just being overt with the client about what they can expect. So here are some strategies for enhancing and maintaining reflective self-awareness. So when they are in the trauma and emotion processing, we need to model for them reflective self-awareness. So we're doing that by asking them questions, by maintaining a neutral posture, by maintaining a neutral cadence to our voice, a tone. Like, so we're modeling it in all ways of like our willingness to be curious. So that's, that's this, I wonder what's going on. It could also be some self-disclosure that, like if maybe you've gone through some of this work to say like, yep, this was this was a point where I got stuck too. It's very normal or something like that, or normalizing through, this is a place where many of my clients get stuck, and here's what's been helpful for some of them. What do you think about maybe any of these tactics? So it's this acceptance of the fact that this is like an ebb and flow, a high and low, a backward and forward, and, this recursive experience. But you're doing everything, you're modeling everything for the client that you would like for them to be able to do for themselves. And you're not going like, here's what I'm modeling for you. Like, it's not that overt. You're just, your presence and the way that you position yourself is meant to model that for them. So you're also modeling how to develop and test theories, potentially regarding the motivations and intent of people to help make sense of their actions. So you don't want to spend too much time here. Just in general, like whenever you have a client that comes in where maybe they've, experienced a trauma at the hands of another person, you don't want to spend too much time focusing on why that person did what they did. You want to create space for it because I'm sure it's something that your client is struggling with. But if you spend too much time focusing on that other individual, that takes time away from the person that's sitting in front of you. So, and it ends up becoming like very content oriented, where you're like, oh, then what did they say? Well, what do you think that meant? Or whatever. So you might want to, you can dip into it, because then you're, creating space for something that may be important for the client to just spend some time on. But if you're finding that you're spending like entire sessions or multiple sessions talking about this other person, you likely won't see movement with the client if you don't also attend to, what's it like to be thinking about this kind of stuff with this other person? Is this something that you've ever done before? How did that go for you? So you're still flipping it so they're able to talk about their own experience too, even during the hypothesis and like testing and developing theories portion. So when should you stop phase 2? So we're still talking about phase 2 here. So this isn't someplace where the client needs to be forever. Therapy is meant to be time limited in a certain sense. The hope is that you are no longer needed because you've equipped the client with confidence and tools and awareness and insight and affect regulation and all these beautiful things. So when the client's no longer troubled by the memory, that can be one indicator for that. Another indicator is their ability to have a personal lifeline. So they're understanding their life that's coherent in a negative structure or a narrative structure that is integrated. So again, they may still have gaps, and that's okay. But if you find that they're no longer activated by this memory and that they're able to have this more coherent, chronologically like accurate and this integrated narrative, these are indicators that you can move on to phase 3, where then you are building on relationships. You also want to check to see if this sense of resolution is more generalized beyond just like the incident that they're talking about in therapy, and that are they feeling less activated or less distressed in their general like day-to-day encounters. So if their like overall level of anxiety, their overall level of activation is lower, that's a really good indicator that you're probably safe to move on to step 3. But again, it's recursive. So they may be in phase 3 and really need to establish safety. And there may be something new that comes up that takes you through the process again. So tactics for preventing and managing crises. So in phase 2, one of the reasons that a crisis can happen is impatience, either on the client's part or on our part. So reasons for impatience on our part can be many. Managed care absolutely can be part of it, where you feel a sense of restriction or constriction with insurance. You may have pressure from a supervisor. You may have pressure from other places. You may find like your self-confidence in yourself as a therapist is contingent on seeing progress, and you've already put in your own head what you think progress looks like for this client. So there's so many reasons why you might like unintentionally kind of buck the process. So our job here is to really model patience and validate the importance of these like small victories. You looked down a street while you were walking today that you haven't looked down in months. That's awesome. Like, let's talk a little bit about that. You went grocery shopping. You sat in the car in the parking lot of the grocery store. You didn't go in. That's okay. Like, let's talk a little bit about like what it was like to sit in your car. That's like, so just these little things that seemingly, I really believe that it's our job as a therapist to be like the client's cheerleader. And when hopefully they come to a place where they can identify some of these smaller things, but usually in the modeling process, that's where you have to say like, that's huge, like, or, that's a step. So we're there to identify these things that they're doing that they may be unaware of. So if you find somebody that is in a crisis, you want to go back to the skills of emotional modulation before beginning or resuming any sort of exposure or processing activity. So remember, you always want to make sure that they're stable, they're stabilized, that they're feeling safe, that, all of that is established before you move to this kind of like higher order emotional processing. Again, modulating. So if the client starts to have intrusive re-experiencing, you are pausing, you're stepping back, you're refocusing on self-regulation skills, strengthening the client's capacity, making sure that you have this secure attachment, doing your part in establishing that. And then you might want to collaboratively develop a working theory about why the procedure is triggering. So that, again, it's insight oriented. What's going on? Let's connect yourself to that. So what you really want is for the client to come away from the setback with a better understanding of their trigger. So this is where the normalization is really important of, this was a part of the healing, and understanding a little bit better what's going on with yourself is super important. Because many times we think we're in a better place emotionally than we are, and we take risks to like prove something to ourselves, and that can really bite us in the butt sometimes. So just highlighting the importance of learning and then going about it in a different way next time. So Herman focused solely on this, but it was mentioned in the Cordis text of the loss and mourning as these things that happen in phase 2 of processing. So the client may not recognize loss until you get to phase 2. So remember, loss isn't just like a death or a breakup or a loss of a job. It's a loss of a vision of the future. It's a loss of a feeling of safety. It's a loss of a sense of self. It's a loss of identity. It's a loss of stability. There's so many things that are lost in trauma. And this is where in phase 2 that you make these overt. And then you have to attend to like, what do we do with this loss? So repetitive compulsions or traumatic reenactments may be ways to try to gain something that was lost, something that was previously unavailable. So you're like kind of trying to change the past. So we talked about, this loss of a sense of agency, right? This loss of a sense of self, a boundary violation that's happened, of people going back and imagining what it might be like to do that differently, or to even go back to the site of the assault or something like that, to try to feel like you have some control, or maybe you can undo this sense of stuckness from the past. Accepting the loss means admitting to its reality and the inability to control the circumstances. And also this like moving forward of there is an inability, it is not realistic to go back and amend, to change history, that any attempt will be futile. So it doesn't mean that the client won't do it, but when they do, you're like, even if if you say it won't help and the client's like, I bet you it will, and they go and do that, you're not going to return and have them tell you, and you'd be like, I told you it wasn't going to work. It's okay, let's talk about it. How did that go? Like basically, what are we going to do differently moving forward? So there's this acceptance of all of these attempts, right? So you're looking at this human as someone who's just trying to heal. They're trying to do their best. And there are ways that are counterproductive that they will likely try. And it is not your job to be like, I warned you that this wasn't going to work. It's all right, let's talk about it. Let's process it. Let's create space for it. So it's just this acceptance of this person just doing their best, trying to heal. So then we get to phase 3, which is the consolidating therapeutic gains. I always just think of, so my postdoc, I studied psychedelics, and like adding a psychedelic component to CBT treatment for cocaine use disorder. And this consolidating therapeutic gains is literally called in the psychedelic field integration. So this is taking everything that you've learned and going, all right, now what do we do with that in the real world, like outside of therapy? So the goal of phase 3 is to take the knowledge and skills that you've gained in treatment and apply it to your daily life and look very future oriented. So phase 3 is very present and future oriented in terms of taking the skills, insights, all of these things, and how do I move forward with it? So you're taking these gains, therapeutic gains, toward goals, right? So the hope is that, the client is moving toward achieving treatment goals, and looking back at these goals that the client had in the first place and saying, like, how are we doing? How can we apply what we learned to these things? So the hope here is that old maladaptive mechanisms, patterns, symptoms, that they no longer have an effect, or they don't really have a place because the client realizes the old schema that they were applied to, so they're no longer appropriate. So, and if they are there, that you have space to analyze them and create some reality around them of okay, so you're no longer unsafe, you have a different living situation, you have a different social network situation, things like that. So just really evaluating the reality of where the client is at today and applying all of the more adaptive mechanisms, patterns, and behaviors to present day. So again, I mentioned this already, but this is a phase-oriented treatment, which doesn't mean it's linear, right? Like you don't go from phase 1 and then you're done. Like you never look back at phase 1. So it's a phase-oriented, and this is where in that informed consent that you talk about it. This is a 3-phase treatment. We move in and out of each phase. Just because we move to one phase doesn't mean there's no value in returning to a phase that we were in. Maybe there's something more that needs to be learned, something that needs to be practiced. So again, this recursive nature just basically means back and forth. So you can go to previously learned tasks and skills that in order to reinforce them at a later time. So again, just really highlighting that it's not once you've moved through it, you never look back. So here's just some, again, this is very similar to the work that we did with psychedelics and I just have a lot of connections that I make here between the two works, because a lot of our clients who were using cocaine had trauma histories, surprise, surprise. So what we found in our work was that there would be clients that were very, very focused on their use, right? So the beginning of their treatment, super focused on their use, and that's all that they were thinking about. And then once they had exposure to the psychedelic, or here, exposure to the treatment, that trauma kind of becomes more distant in a way that it's not as activating, it's not as present. And then they kind of realize these areas of their lives that they haven't attended to because they've just been surviving, right? So these are areas that you can, I would put these things in your back pocket when you're working with people, because getting through the trauma is one thing, and then like living this full fulfilling life is a whole other thing. So you may talk about things like career development, looking at relationships, understanding interdependence, and in exploring that and incorporating that into their lives. What does intimacy look like? What is healthy sexuality? I want to talk about child rearing and parenting issues. So all of these, it's like almost like the fog of trauma is kind of cleared, and they can see all of these other things that they are, and all of these other areas of their life that they are a part of, that they haven't really been fully participating in, fully present in, where it's like, well, shit, like, how do I, reconnect with my kids? How do I reconnect with my partner? I have space for this. I have a desire to do this. I have confidence that I can. And so I really want to encourage you to create space for this. Other things like, how do I tell other people about this? What about looking into the, criminal justice system and seeing if I can, pursue legal action? And then, of course, you would have a conversation about the legal system and how it's not really set up to support survivors and stuff like that. But, maybe this is something that is a really important part of their healing. So they may want to talk about interacting with individuals who have harmed them, who have maltreated them. What would this look like? They may also have like existential issues around spirituality, religion, personal meaning making. One of the things that you will have clients who say to you like things like, what does all this mean? Just these really existentially oriented questions. What is the purpose of all of this? And I really want to encourage you to really defer to the client and really defer to the idea that this is a lifelong process. Like existential issues aren't existential because you can answer them quickly. So please try not to give an answer. I would even potentially encourage you against engaging in like your perspective on these things. And just really, again, you're modeling tolerance for some of the unknown, tolerance for the ambiguity of life. Like there's so many things in life that we don't know. So as the last piece says, the client's conclusions about spirituality and life are best viewed as a work in progress rather than this like chapter in a book that can be closed when they're done with therapy. So just really encouraging this like growth mindset of being willing to engage in these things and how that can inherently help make meaning. Okay, so we'll go ahead and stop here. How far did we make it, y'all? All right. I mean, we got about halfway through. I think we'll move a little bit quicker though, because a lot of this stuff that we'll be covering next week is there was a little bit of redundancy. I hate to say redundancy. It was covered from different angles in the different texts. But again, very interested in your feedback on this. So please, as you're going through this stuff, note what's helpful, maybe what was less engaging, things like that, because as I go through and teach this class in future years, just working to make it my own and make it as like manageable and palatable for all the students. Okay, so let's go ahead, and if you haven't already, kind of have your notebook, your pen, paper, crayons, whatever you've got, and we will lean into this second, similar than as last week, but just again, seeing variations. And then if any of you have any like meditative techniques or anything that you want to incorporate into class, please don't hesitate to let me know. So I'll share my screen again, and we'll go into some mindfulness drawing again.
Hi everyone, and thank you once again for joining me here at Art Life. My name is Mrs. B, and today I have a bit of a different task for you. Normally I would show you what the product looks like, but we're not focusing on an outcome or a product today. It's all about the process. The intention of today's activity is to have a go at using some mindfulness strategies, some self-expressive strategies to create a relaxed art lesson all about the process, not the outcome. Mindfulness teaches us to pay full attention to something. It means that we're going to slow down so we can notice the things that we're doing and the things that are around us. Being mindful is the opposite to multitasking or rushing around, which I do a lot of. So it's very good to be mindful sometimes. It means to take your time and be focused in a relaxed, easygoing sort of way. Now, I'm used to doing a lot of multitasking in my life. I'm generally quite busy and rushing around. So I thought it would be a great practice for me to learn. So I've been looking into mindfulness a lot lately, and then thought I would put what I've learned into a lesson for you guys to follow along to learn some mindfulness at home through art. Now, this task is appropriate for kids or adults, and it takes about 15 minutes. I'll go through 3 different mindfulness or self-expressive techniques that I've learnt to help us to notice what we're doing, notice our breath, and use the things around us to inspire our drawing or our art today. And while you're here, please make sure that you subscribe below and give me a thumbs up if you've liked this mindfulness activity. Let's get started. Thank you for joining me for this mindfulness exercise today. I am an art teacher. I am not an art therapist, and there is a difference, but I have been looking closely into mindfulness lately, and I hope I've created a lesson that you can use to help to relieve any stress you might be feeling and just be present within the current moment that you're in. Now, all you need today is a piece of paper and a pen, and if you have some coloured materials like crayons, that will help as well. It doesn't need to be a pretty piece of paper. I'm literally using a scrap notebook at the moment to show you that you don't need fancy art materials to do this task. Now, this lesson is all about self-expression, and there's no right or wrong way to make this artwork. It is self-guided by the things that mean something to you and that matter to you in this present moment. Please just use my voice as a guide for your own artwork and your own drawing today. Now, mindfulness is all about being present within the moment that you are in. So we're going to try to do that now by noticing some things around us. Now, try to listen to the techniques I'm giving you to breathe deeply and to use art as you're being mindful. Now, the first task we're going to do together is called drawing the breath. Now, in noticing our breath and breathing deeply and breathing slowly, we're going to try to draw this as a line. Just going to start on the side of my picture here. And when I breathe in, I'm going to move my pen up toward the top of the paper. And as I begin to breathe out, I'm going to bring it down to the bottom of my paper. And my drawing is going to recognize the flow of my breath. Now, the idea is not to breathe in a fast way so that our pen goes like this. We want it to be nice, long, deep breaths, and for you to really notice the breath going in and out of your lungs. So let's start now. As you're breathing, go up, and as you start to breathe out, turn your pen downward. When you breathe in again, move it upward. And down. In and out. As you're drawing, try to aim to take nice deep breaths and continue this motion in and out for the next minute. I'll place some nice music on and I want you to focus on the in and out of your breath. Your drawing does not need to be perfect. Well done, everybody. The next mindfulness exercise we're going to do today is to notice the things that are around us by using our 5 senses. Those senses are what you smell around you, what you are touching around you, maybe the surface that you're working on, the texture of the things that you can touch around you. What do you hear? What can you see? And if you have anything in your mouth, what can you taste? You might not be able to use your taste sense at the moment, for example, but you can hone into one of the other senses. Just focus on one for today. And whatever you focus on, I want you to try to really notice it. How does it make you feel? And what might it look like as a line? And begin to draw what it is that you're noticing. You might be able to see members of your family. That might make you feel happy or loved. You could draw that as one line. You might be able to hear some birds or some things in the background. You could maybe draw what you hear, the music, within a line as well. Your line is very likely to look different to mine because we're able to see different things at the moment. If nothing necessarily inspires you around where you are right now, I'm going to play more music and you could use that sound to inspire the line that you draw for the next minute. Really listen. Wonderful. Now, I hope during that task you weren't concentrating on what I was drawing, but you're concentrating on the senses that you are feeling and what that might look like in a line. These types of exercises really help to notice the things around us, and that means being mindful and in the present moment. For the next exercise, I'd love for you to think about 3 things that are making you happy today, right now. Of course, the things that you think of will be very different to the things that are making me happy. There are some things within this world at the moment that are scary, that might make us feel anxious, but we're not focusing on those in this present moment. We're thinking of things that are positive, that are in our life, that bring us joy. You can write them in the corner of your page. Today, in my present moment, we are in lockdown due to the coronavirus, and so we don't have much else except for what is in our home, and the only thing we're allowed to do at the moment is go for a walk. So walking is bringing me joy at the moment, and of course my two daughters, Sadie and Delilah, bring me joy every day. So they're my three things that are bringing me joy and making me happy in this present moment. With your three things, I'd like for you, if you have some coloured crayons, coloured textures, coloured pastels, something coloured that you have at home, I'd love for you to now designate a colour to each of these three things that make you feel happy. You only need three colours. Sadie's in yellow because she's very bright and happy kind of personality. So she just makes me think of the happiest colour of all, which is yellow. Delilah is 2 years old and she is full of beans and very energetic. So that makes me think of orange. And walking and being out in nature makes me think of green. So now, with the last 2 minutes of this exercise, I'd love for you to use these three colours within your mindfulness kind of line here. You may choose to do a different artwork. It doesn't really need to be of anything. It can just sort of represent the things that make you happy in an abstract way, in a realistic way. And this exercise will just help you to really think about these three positive things in your life and focus on them for the next 2 minutes while you're drawing. Well done, everybody. I hope that this exercise has helped you to try to focus to be within the present moment and find joy and happiness within the moment you're in. Art washes away from the soul the dust of everyday life. That was said by Picasso, and I think his words are absolutely Please feel free to repeat this exercise daily. Your artwork might change based on the day and based on what you're focusing on each day. And it can be used at the beginning of an art lesson. It can be used at the beginning of your day. It can be used in any situation and anywhere you are.
All right. Go ahead and stop that share. Sorry, y'all, if you heard me moving. I didn't know if you could hear my partner in the other room chatting during this, so I figured I'd come into my room. Does anybody care to share what they created, or even like care to share their thoughts on these last 2 weeks of incorporating some art into mindfulness? Do we have a favorite so far of all the mindfulness techniques that we've done?
I guess I can share. I really like this one, just because I think it brought more peace, and like I caught myself in a moment where I think when she was asking like what 3 things make you happy, and just really like it just zoned me in, and like I was like, okay, I'm happy right now. And I think feeling over from the weeks previously, just the amount of stress feeling right now, and I don't know, it just really took me to a happy place. So it was really nice. I think this is my favorite so far.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing, Vanessa. Yeah, so speaking of, I think you bring up a great point here too, Vanessa. Speaking of stress, recognizing that we're getting into the end of the semester, please let me know how I can support you. I think what I'm going to do is just post the final right now and give you basically a month to do it. So you have access to it. Again, the goal of this field, I don't think, is to memorize all the things. It's to use your resources. If you want to, go ahead and try to answer as many of the questions on the final, like off the top of your head, or take a pass through it without any resources and then go ahead and amend it. I think it's a good, almost like a pre-post test, like what you guys were doing on TFCBT and CPT, of like, what have I taken in? Like, what is more solid in there? And then the ones that trip you up a little bit, then it's just an indicator of maybe I need to read a little bit more about this or take a little bit more time. But yeah, so I'll go ahead. Hopefully that can be helpful. So again, for those of you who endorsed writing the paper, great, do that. For those of you who endorsed doing the presentation, awesome, do that. I'll figure out a good amount of time for that. And we will probably be using weeks 14 and 15. I want to be sure that we attend to all of this stuff from this week. We got to go about halfway through. I'm going to see if I can maybe consolidate some stuff and go through a little bit quicker. For the sake of pacing, let's go ahead and still read for next week, like all of the articles that we have for next week. And we'll just see how far we get next week and have a little bit of a buffer. But thank you everybody for sticking with me, still figuring out how to consolidate all this information. But I look forward to seeing all of you next week. I hope you have a wonderful week, and please just stay communicative with me if you need any extension support or anything like that. Have a great week, guys.
Thank you, Dr. Lappin.
For the final,
Yeah.
you said it's going to be multiple choice and you'll post it like soon. Is that just going to be like a Word document, or is it on Qualtrics? Okay, so you want us to maybe just like highlight our answers, or?
Exactly.
Okay.
Highlight it, bold it, just indicate one of them sticking out. So italicize it, do something to let me know this is my choice.
Okay, thank you.
All right, great. Thank you guys. See you later.